You are about to enter the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast on shockwaveskullsessions.com. And now your host, Bob Nalbandian.
All right, thanks for checking out another episode of the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast. This is episode number 34. And, wow, this is a real killer episode. It's a long one. It's about 90 minutes long. But believe me, you will be thoroughly entertained for the next 90 minutes because we've got one of the most notorious heavy metal journalist authors on this podcast. That's right, Mr. Mick Wall from England joins us, along with one of my personal favorite journalists here in the U.S. from the 80s and a good friend of mine, John Sutherland. And another very close friend of mine, of course, you know him as the great bass player from Armored Saint, Joey Vera. So this is a killer episode. And the theme on this one is, well, there's really not one particular theme. But basically, if I was to put a title on this episode, it would be the early 80s metal scene, both in Los Angeles and the UK. Of course, we actually go back into the late 70s, talk about the early LA clubs, pre the MTV metal phenomena in the early to mid 80s. And we also talked to Mick about the new wave of British heavy metal scene, which took place during that time in, of course, England. So a fantastic episode. I really enjoy this one. I do believe you guys are going to as well. So we're going to get right into it. This, of course, is the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast, heard at roadrunnerrecords.com/skull sessions. You can also check it out at several podcast directories, including iTunes and our newest podcast directory host, Zune.net. So be sure to check it out there as well. And you can subscribe to all the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast through both Zune.net and, of course, iTunes. You can also check out my sister podcast, the Shockwaves Hard Radio podcast. And I recently posted the latest episode, which features a lot of great interviews, including Age of Evil, DC4, Rev Jones, the Texas Hippie Coalition, Vinnie Moore, Juan Garcia, the great Paul Diano, Icarus Witch, and Fatal Smile. So once again, check that at hardradio.com. And of course, don't forget to send me your comments and suggestions. I love to hear from you. I do read and answer all the emails. So hit me up at shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com. With that said, man, let's get right into it. This is Mick Wall, John Sutherland, and Joey Vera. Now Mick, this book is Star Trippin' is actually the title of the book, correct?
Well, no, actually, Bob, no. Star Tripping was a book I self-published 4 years ago because it was the 25th anniversary of Kerrang! So I just made a book, just a very small run of books that was originally meant to be for just what I really thought at most there would be a few hundred people maybe that would like one. And it was 16 stories from the 80s with a little introduction written now, just kind of setting the scene. And then what happened was there was such a demand for it that we then printed another few hundred more to try and keep up. I was just selling it through my website, and we couldn't keep up because I'm not a proper publisher. I couldn't afford to make more of them. And to cut a long story short, 4 years later, my regular publisher asked me if I'd like to do a bigger, more expanded edition. So what it is in the UK this week, and it'll be coming out in the USA a little bit later this year, it's a new book called, wait for it, Appetite for Destruction, and it's actually 31 stories from the Kerrang! Days with new introductions, but also new codas. You know, so each story has got a new beginning or a new scene setting section, and then at the end I do a kind of a what happened next thing, and it's really weird because over here immediately there's a lot of interest, and I was very surprised because these are quite old stories, you know, obviously very old stories, but I think what's turning people on over here is that they love to hear the stories about what they now consider the real rock bands. It's now kind of seen as like a golden age for rock music, when bands still toured and made albums, and It wasn't confusing. It wasn't on the internet. It wasn't any MTV until a bit later on. It was just, did you see the gig? Do you have the album? And of course, we had those giant personalities. And even all the new bands come along, and I include Armored Saint in this, and right up to the whole Bay Area scene with Testament and people like that. You've got real characters and personalities in those bands, and they're kind of seen as sort of giants now, compared to a very different world we live in now.
Now, those that are unfamiliar with Mick Wall, that might have been living in a cave, you've been doing stuff, obviously, since the late 70s with Sounds, I remember. And not only as a writer, you got into publicity, you worked for Heavy Publicity. I was checking out your website, all the different stuff I wasn't even familiar with that you had done prior to, working at Kerrang. And, of course, all the books you wrote. In 86, you did that big Aussie book, I remember, when that came out, Diary of a Madman. That was the British title. I think you had a different title in the States. Is that right?
Actually, I think it might have been the same title, Bob, although, because, like a lot of bands that signed crazy deals in their early days, that was my first book, and I signed a crazy deal which gave me no royalties and no rights to anything, and I think what happened was they just kind of sold that book around the world, and it did eventually come out with different titles and different covers and all kinds of crazy stuff. But it was my first book, and it was Aussie, and I was like 26 at the time, and all I could think about was, I'm going to do a book, and it's going to be on Aussie, and it's going to be great, and, where do I sign, but that was the first one all those years ago. Before Kerrang, I'd actually been working in the business for about 5 or 6 years. Started out writing about punk, as almost everybody had to do who began writing in this country in 1977. I really dug the whole punk thing, but I'd always also liked Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, Thin Lizzy, so it was no hardship for me to also write about the rock scene. And then I got a job with a PR company called Heavy Publicity that specialized in doing those bands. We used to do the PR for Sabbath, for Thin Lizzy. We also did groups like Journey and REO Speedwagon and Dire Straits. But that was all that stuff in Britain at that time. If you weren't punk, you were this other stuff. So by the time, to cut a long story short, by the time Kerrang comes along in the early 80s, it was like, wow, this is great, because now here is a magazine actually devoted specifically to this stuff. Not only that, but suddenly there's this enormous amount of brand coming out of America, coming out of Britain, coming out of Europe. Suddenly, so we had a lot to write about that wasn't being covered anywhere else.
Well, let's briefly go over some of your other books. I mean, you did a couple books on Guns N' Roses, or you did the Guns N' Roses book, and you did the Axl Rose biography. You did that big Maiden biography, I remember, Run to the Hills. You did the couple Black Sabbath books, that Ozzy book. You did the Black Days with Black Sabbath and Other Horror Stories, which I thought was a real interesting book. And of course, the Zeppelin book was a huge book, When Giants Walk the Earth. So, if you want to check anything else, rather than, it'll take a whole podcast to go through your whole biography. Just go to mickwall.com. And you got a new Metallica book that you're currently working on, correct, Mick? You want to briefly talk about that, or?
Yeah. After Led Zeppelin, it was like, well, what are you going to do next? And how, what do you do after Led Zeppelin? You've done this enormous band with this huge story. Where do you go next? It kind of really narrowed itself down to, there are only a couple of bands left after Led Zeppelin that either I haven't done a book about yet already, or are as big and have as interesting a story. And I think Metallica, as soon as I thought of it, it was obvious, because there have been a lot of books actually on Metallica, but I don't think there's been one yet that tried really, really hard to tell it from a more mature standpoint. So of course it's about the music, but it's also about the world that they came from, the world that we live in now, why they made some of the choices they made, the irony, of course, in Cliff's death, being such a terrible blow on so many levels, kind of stopped them being the amazing group that they were at that point. But in another strange way, kind of freed them as well to go on and be as commercially successful as they did. And then, of course, by the time you get to the 90s, I mean, that could be a book in itself when you talk about what was going on with Load and Reload, what was going on with Saint Anger. I just think all the great stories have highs and lows and have surprises and have tragedy and have triumph. And the Metallica story has kind of got it all. And I think the main theme that I like most about it is that for me, in a way, they're kind of maybe the last of their kind, because they came from the world that Zeppelin ruled. They came from that world where you still had to get in the van and go out and play gigs and take it to the people, and you still put stuff out on 12 inches of plastic. And they're still ruling this world here in the 21st century, where it looks like that stuff, not just records, but CDs, it looks like that stuff's gone. I mean, they're now even saying there may never even be another Metallica album. I'm sure there will, but we live in a world where it's not a certainty anymore. We live in a world where we now have Guitar Hero and Rock Band and Wii and the Internet, and we live in an entirely different planet now. And they kind of straddle both worlds for me. The world that I grew up as a kid digging and being fascinated by, and the world I find myself in now as a middle-aged man with kids. Still, this group are ruling that rock world. And I think it's an interesting story. Going on too long, sorry fellas. I think it's an interesting story, and I think there are a lot of interesting aspects to it.
I think this might be our longest intro here. John Sutherland, you've got.
I loved it. I really enjoyed it. To be honest with you.
It's great. It's great. We got all the time in the world for this. John Sutherland, you're kind of like the U.S. version of Mick Wall. I like to say.
Not really. I mean, he's the real journalist. I'm really a fan that got talked into being a journalist. That's really my angle. I mean, I started out writing for Runner's World of all places, and when a neighbor of mine started a little magazine called Record Review, I said, hey, I can write. So I wrote a story about Thin Lizzy and Queen, and then started doing interviews and doing all that stuff. But I always maintain I've always been a fan, much more so than a writer. I mean, I was reluctant going into the business, but I really always enjoyed the music, and I've always kind of kept my distance. I never really got that close to it. I was a publicist like Mick for a while, did that for a bit. But I always felt more comfortable being in the audience watching the bands.
Right. Now, you started writing for Record Review around when Mick started writing for Sounds, right?
Well, we started in 76 and went from 76 to 84. For the first 6 or 7 years, I didn't write for any other magazines. I didn't have time. I mean, I was running 120 miles a week and trying to be a track star. You know, I started looking over the fence a little bit and figured out everybody knew who I was, even though I didn't try that hard. But we didn't have the wonderful press like England had. I used to go to Hollywood Boulevard to buy those magazines because we didn't have that here. In the 70s, we had Hit Parader, which really just printed lyrics and pictures. Right. And Circus was like half TV and half rock. And Cream was really esoteric and into a lot of really punk bands, and didn't cover metal at all. And here was
your specialty issues, like Cream would do Cream metal, and
they do it every once in a while, but they didn't. I kind of felt like they didn't really like it. They were so into being critics and Lester Bangs and all that stuff.
Very much.
And I was just a hero. My policy was I don't write about bands I don't like. What's the point? So here I am, like putting Dio and Iron Maiden and Def Leppard on the cover of a tiny 60,000 circulation magazine that sold most of its copies in the Midwest. And I found out I had a following, and I was probably one of the few guys in this country that was even gave a crap about metal. And the biggest compliment I ever got was one time, and it was at Armored Saint Party, Joey, where Lars cornered me and he said, every time you said a record was good back in the day, I bought it and you never let me down.
Wow.
And now you also, of course, wrote, which more the metal crowd might know you for, is a Rip magazine. You were one of the main contributors at Rip. BAM magazine, of course, in L.A. was a big... you did some stuff with the L.A. Times as well, and Metal Hammer, and a few...
Yeah, well, you know what's funny? After a while, people started coming to me. I didn't have an anchor, really, ever, other than Record Review and Blast when I did those. But... I had a column for 7 years in L.A. called Molten Metal, which was really popular. Yeah. Everybody knew about it. Everybody read it. Everybody wanted to get into it. I mean, I put my home address as the contact. I used to get flyered. I'd come home to my house and I'd be flyered. Like one time I got a bunch of bootleg cassettes from Richard Bishop, who was the manager of Hanoi Rocks. And I said, first person that tells me Razzle's real name wins my second copy. I get home from work, and there's like 25 like Nicholas Dingley notes on my front door. So it was really kind of a fun time. You know, I mean, metal was king, and you know, I had the coolest column in town, but it was a fun time, Bob. It really was fun. You know, there's a lot of great bands, and you know, being from LA and seeing the whole thing evolve. I'm older than all you guys. I'll be 60 this year, and I saw the first LA scene with the Byrds and the Doors and Love and all those guys, and it was kind of with a lot of pride that, you know, I watched Van Halen and Quiet Riot and all the other bands come up. It was really, really a fun time.
All right. Do you want to talk about any current projects you're involved with, John? Or
well, here's the deal. I mean, I kind of did what Mick did a long time ago when I had those. I did a bunch of stories for KNAC when I first started out on the website, and I've been just pulling my hair out trying to figure out to tell my story. And I think what I'm going to do, and I've been working on it for years, I just haven't figured out the format I want to do. I'm going to write a memoir. Instead of doing stories about the band, I'm going to just do, here's what I saw in chronological order and pretty much the interesting anecdotes that went along with it. And my goal is to finish it before the year's over. But I've been working on it for 5 or 6 years, and I just didn't really figure out the format until just the last month or so.
All right. Well, we'll definitely be on the lookout for that. And Joey, I know Armored Saint's been hard at work on their new record. In fact, you got it coming out next month.
Yeah,
right?
I'm afraid that all these introductions have overshadowed me quite a bit. I mean, let me dim the lights a little bit here. I'm in the presence of greatness. I'm sorry, what was the question?
Who are you, Joey? That's the question.
Oh, yes, Armored Saint. We did just finish our record a few months ago, and it is coming out on Metal Blade on March 16th, and it is called La Raza. It's funny because a couple of people have pointed out that I guess we were on this schedule of making records every 10 years. So we're setting a new precedent for rock bands in the future. We're going to make the cycles for records every 10 years now. So
just like Boston did, right?
Yeah, so we can slow down the age of information. We were trying to slow it down a little bit. So
maybe you should have Axl Rose join your band.
Exactly. As if we're not in debt enough.
First, you're also involved, Joey, with a lot of production projects. You want to talk about some of the production you've been doing? And, of course, you've been, playing with a lot of different bands over the years, including Fate's Warning. And, what about some of the other projects you're involved with, JoJo?
Well, I'm still involved with Fates. We're getting ready to make a new record. I think we're in the late April is when we're supposed to start recording. And on the production side, I've been doing some stuff kind of locally. I work with a great band here out of LA called Mother Superior.
Yeah, great
band.
And
we just finished a record in the fall for them. Working also with some other groups locally. That's really about it. Just trying to stay busy here.
All right. Well, got the introductions out of the way. All right, gentlemen, let's get into this. Now, what I want to talk about, John talking about, and we're not going to go back as far as the Byrds and the Doors, but I do.
I know that.
The late 70s scene. And, of course, Mick Wall being from England and being a very huge influence writing-wise on the new wave of British heavy metal. Kind of talk about the early days of the new wave of British heavy metal and how it was in contrast with the LA metal scene. I know, of course, Joey Vera, you being with Armored Saint, and a lot of people may not know you were in previous bands. You were in a band with Tommy Lee before Armored Saint. You were in the Greg Leon Invasion. So we're talking like 79, 80 when you were with these bands, Joey?
Yeah, 79, 80, 81, those 3 years, which is probably right when, new wave of British heavy metal was just starting to bubble over. But, what would you say, when was the very first spark of the new wave of British heavy metal, would you say, Mick?
78 into 79. In fact, Jeff Barton, who was the guy who came up with the whole idea for doing a story in Sounds magazine, came to me. I was a very young writer on Sounds, and he had this idea. He wanted to do 2 stories. One would be the new wave of British heavy metal, which would be a roundup of a lot of groups that he had identified in the UK at that point as being new, as being metal, which was actually a very exciting idea at the time because punk was so enormous that it looked like it had kind of killed off the whole metal scene at that point. And then suddenly Jeff could see there were a bunch of new bands all coming along around about the same time, some obviously better than others. But he also had this other idea. We were going to do the new wave of British heavy metal, and then he was going to follow that up with a story called The New Wave of American Heavy Metal. And to cut a long story short, in between planning these stories, I got that job at that PR company, and so I had to go back to Jeff and talk about kicking yourself in the ass. I had to tell him, I'm not going to be able to write this story. I've got this job. I'm leaving. And so Jeff, and because he was going to do the American one and I was going to do the British one, because I think he wanted to go to America, you know. So Jeff ended up doing the British one, and it took off so quickly. There was such a great reaction from the readers. But I think he may never have done the American one in the end, or if he did, he maybe did it a long while later. The whole idea of this new wave of British heavy metal really captured the imagination of the Sounds readers. And so, as all magazines do, they said, look, we're getting all these letters, let's do more of this stuff. And so in 79, you suddenly had places like Neil Kay, a famous metal DJ from those days. He had a venue called the Bandwagon, which was just a bar, really. But Sounds would run Neil Kay's Bandwagon Top 20, and it would have things like the very first Iron Maiden demo would be #1 in the chart, you know, and Saxon, and all the groups we now think of, Tigers of Pantang, Angel Witch. And so it was 79. I mean, by the time Maiden's first album came out in like March 1980, that went straight into the UK charts at #4, first week of release. So the whole new wave of British heavy metal thing at that point was very much overground. I mean, Leopard had scored a major deal. Everybody thought Diamond Head were going to be the new Led Zeppelin. It was the cat was out of the bag, you know. It was no longer a secret, and it was suddenly very mainstream in the UK.
Well, you know, it's funny. I think I do remember in Sounds, I don't know how long after the New Wave of British Heavy Metal article, but I remember it was around when Kerrang was actually already out, but they did do a L.A. metal scene, and you might remember this, John. I think it was Sylvia Simmons or Laurel Canyon or whatever she went by, and it wasn't near the impact of the British scene, but they touched on about, you know, maybe 20 bands that had come out of L.A. At the time. Now, Mick, you had actually moved to L.A. at some time, right? Was that in the 80s or the 90s?
No, that was right at the end of the 80s, very beginning of the 90s. But the first time I came to L.A. was way back in 1980, and I started coming more regularly from 84 onwards. So by the time I arrived, I mean, on a regular basis in 84, of course there is Motley Crue, but I also remember being on tour with Rat when they were opening for Billy Squier, and that was their kind of big breakthrough moment because the crowd was going nuts for Rat every night, and Billy not so much, you know.
Poor Billy Squier. Didn't Def Leppard open for Billy Squier too? That was their first big tour, and same thing happened.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Billy was really big there for a few years, and he kept getting these hot opening acts that kind of stole his thunder a little bit, you know. But by the time I get there, Malice had now got a major deal, and there was this band from San Francisco called Metallica that were doing okay, and the whole LA scene for me kind of took place somewhere between the Roxy and the Rainbow, you know, and Tower Records. It was from a British perspective, it was very much about the whole look, the hair, the makeup, and really that lifestyle. It was very exciting for British, from grey old England to come to LA and just see women, and the guys look better than our women, and let alone the women, you know. So just a very exciting scene, you know.
Well, that's something, I think it was Stefan Chirasi that had mentioned that in a podcast we did previously, and that was the thing that attracted a lot of the British bands to come over to America and, you know, to be big rock stars in LA. They were so infatuated with the whole LA scene because it was about the image, the look, you know, the sunny days, the hot chicks at all the shows. I mean, most of the new wave of British heavy metal shows, kind of like the thrash metal shows in the mid 80s, were pretty much like 95% guys, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, it was so fantastic to leave a place where rock and metal, although it would sell big numbers and you'd have big tours, it was still kind of like, you know, not socially acceptable. I mean, that was part of the excitement of it, but it could also be a bummer because you'd never hear your favorite records on the radio. You'd never see your favorite band on TV. I mean, it's one of the reasons Kerrang became so popular so quickly was it was the only place you could get this stuff written by people that liked it, you know. So to leave that and go to America, I mean, pretty much anywhere we went in America was great by us. But of course, if you hit New York or particularly LA, it was rock city. I mean, you didn't have to explain why you like this stuff. Everybody liked this stuff. I mean, I'd be in some hotel and the waiter would come in and we'd start talking about music and I'd be smoking a joint, and you couldn't imagine stuff like that in England in the early 80s. There was a select band of brothers that knew about this stuff, but you go to America and it was like, I don't know, David Lee Roth once told me that his theory was it was what he called the wagon train spirit, you know, America was built on rock and roll and that, you know, let's get in the wagon train and ride, you know, I mean, and I think there's probably a lot to be said for that. It's that great feeling of wanting to do something exciting right now. From a British perspective, that's what America is, you know.
Yeah. It's funny, there's a little bit of irony in this for me because coming from being in a band at that time, you know, our whole source of any information as far as the metal scene was going on was Kerrang. So we would have to we used to go to Pooh Bah Records, and that's where we'd get our issues of Kerrang there. So we would just sit there, and for us, the whole thing was flip-flop. Like, for us, we were enamored about going to England because we were looking at pictures of, you know, Maiden playing at the Marquee, or like the first time Y&T went there from the U.S. and they played the Marquee, and it looked insane. It just looked like madness, and that's where we wanted to be. So for us being here, although of course I've always admitted that it was a very special time to be here, and in hindsight, it was an amazing time to be here. It was really special. But by the same token, we were influenced by bands that all came from Europe. We were not influenced so much by American groups, but more so by the European groups. So our whole goal at the end of the day was, we have to play the Marquee in front of 520 men. We don't care about the chicks and all this right now. We want to play in front of the headbangers with the leather jackets and the denim vest over it and with the pins and patches all over it. That's what we wanted. That's where we wanted to be. So
I totally concur with Joey. As a fan, I was the same. And of course, bands like Metallica, all they wanted to be was like the new wave of British heavy metal bands. Because here in the States, you know, it was a whole poser mentality. If you lived in LA and seen the way the bands did, it was an entire image thing, particularly when the 80s came around. The late 70s was a little bit different, but when the 80s, it was all about the image. And I was all into the new wave of British heavy metal, and so was, you know, my friends that I hung out with, and it was all about going to the record stores, getting the imports of all the British bands, and, you know, Maiden, Saxon, Samson, you know, Angel Witch, anything we could find, and, you know, even the early singles, the Neat record singles and stuff, and we didn't care about the LA scene. And I was telling Mick earlier, you know, when I would hear, you know, Lars talk about his trip to England, hanging out with Sean Harris and Lemmy from Motorhead and meeting them, I was like, wow, you know, I got to go to England. You know, that is like the coolest thing, you know. I mean, to go see Motley Crue or hang out with them meant nothing to us, you know. You know, go ahead.
Bob, I was going to say, I had a little bit different perspective than all you guys. Being a little bit older, I'd already been going to the record companies by 76, 77, getting interviews and getting promos and doing stuff like that. And what was happening in L.A. at that time was dreadful. It was all these new wave hair bands, you know, really, really bad bands that couldn't play. Yeah. And, you know, I was into all the English bands, Thin Lizzy, Stones, For You, what I grew up on. And then all of a sudden I see the bands around town that are really starting to become something special, really good. And the thing that I really wanted to bring up in this discussion was the level of the musicianship. Because when you go see the Blasters and Los Lobos and stuff that's going on at that time in L.A., that does not touch, you know, the musician level of Yngwie or Eddie Van Halen and some of the guys that came along. But there was nothing going on in L.A. late 70s except Van Halen. And I thought when they got signed, the floodgates would open. I thought Quiet Riot will get a deal. I thought all these other bands I saw would get a deal, and it didn't seem like anybody wanted to sign anybody.
Well, you know,
and it wasn't until Metal Massacre 1 that Slagle got everybody off their butt a little bit, and even then I felt discrimination because, to me, the record companies all would sign one metal band, And it seemed like they were a little bit reluctant to do it. And then these bands would get on the road and they'd start selling records. And then they'd say, shit, we got to figure out how to market these guys. These guys are selling 50,000 records a week.
Yeah. I think I think John's made a good point there, because I think it wasn't until you got younger guys then actually getting jobs, a little bit like the early 70s, I guess, in LA, or the late 60s, you got younger guys suddenly working at record companies like Elektra. Did Zootout sign Motley Crue? Have I got that wrong?
Yeah,
No, I think
he was like in the mail room or something, and he brought the tape to one of the guys.
Right. And so I think there was I think it did. I mean, because also with it, by the time you're thinking of when Van Halen came along, this is the time when Rumours is selling millions of copies, and punk never really took off as a big selling mainstream music in the USA, I guess. And
No.
So I can see why these older record executives are thinking, well, when is John Lennon going to release another album and we'll have a big hit? Why doesn't Cher go and do another album or whatever it is? I can see them being completely baffled by. But then you know what? You think of MTV, who got on the roller coaster with rock music. By the time you get to the late 80s, they were talking about not playing that stuff anymore, and it's always had a tough ride, hasn't it, trying to get into the mainstream. And I think that's one of the reasons kids love the music. But it also is very frustrating when, like John, when you're working in this area, or you're a musician like Joey, and you're in a band trying to make a career for yourself, but you're a special case. There's no way you're going to be A-listed on the radio show unless it's a rock format radio station. You'll get on Headbangers Ball, but you're not going to be on heavy rotation the rest of the time because you're a rock band. I mean, it's a weird thing, isn't it?
True.
Yeah.
But in the late 70s, it was a whole different thing. It was before MTV, and I think record companies then, this is before the whole cookie cutter mentality, because after MTV hit and the image became such a big thing with the LA bands, that's when the labels just started signing any band that sounded like, Motley Crue or Van Halen or whatever. But when Van Halen got signed, it was like, okay, we've got a Van Halen, we don't need another one kind of attitude. Whereas now it's the opposite. If a band like that sounds like Guns N' Roses becomes huge, all these A&R people signing bands that sound just like Guns N' Roses, or when the Seattle scene hit huge, sign as many grunge bands as you can, kind of thing. But back in the late 70s, they didn't really have that, and there were a few bands. I mean, I remember Legs Diamond had a couple records out in the late 70s. And, of course, Quiet Riot had the Japanese imports with Randy Rhoads. And, there are bands like Snow and, Greg Leon Invasion, Dokken with George Lynch. You had a lot of great talent out there. Of course, Y&T in the Bay Area had a couple records out, but they never really did anything until, the 80s scene hit and MTV really exploded. Van Halen was really the only exception at that time.
Well, these bands, they weren't signed, Bob, and they couldn't tour. I mean, all the bands that I liked, Foghat never did a video in their career, but they sold a couple 100,000 records a few times. Everything was based around touring in those days.
True.
And when I saw the bands get signed, I knew they would be fine once people got to see them.
In the 80s, it seemed to me like the 80s, it turned into, the business itself turned into this big, gigantic monster that I don't think we'd ever seen before, where, they were just throwing money at these young bands like it was going out of style. I mean, some of the budgets that you heard of during the 80s, bands getting signed for so much money, and everyone was working in the top studios in LA, and it just seemed like where did this come from? It was almost like it had something to do with the state of society at that point. Maybe everyone was feeling really flush with their money here in the States, so the heavy metal became a really, really big business in the 80s. And of course, we all know that it ended up biting itself in the ass, and it ruined it in a lot of ways. But I never really saw it like that during the 70s, where it was, as you said, Bob, like they would sign a band and then they'd sign, 15 clone bands just because,
Right.
they could spend the money and just because they could throw it all against the wall and see what would stick. And some of it sold pretty well. I mean, Firehouse did pretty good, I guess, but I mean, really,
Well, Joey, I had A&R people tell me that they signed bands deliberately to bury them so another band could make it. I mean, there was all sorts of stupid reasons to do business in those days. It didn't make any sense to me. I always thought, if you really want to know what's going on, listen to the kids, buy the magazines, go to the shows. I got really disconnected when the record companies thought they were the talent and they were trying to make the bands and tell the bands what to look like and what songs to do. And I can't imagine anybody ever telling Steve Harris what song should be on an Iron Maiden record.
Yeah, I mean, it was almost the death of the 80s was like the death of grassroots in a sense. And it didn't really, I feel like it kind of came back like in this resurgence in metal during the 90s where a lot of kids were growing up listening to, Metallica Black Album or the first Pantera record or whatever, or an early Maiden, and then they became the new grassroots. These guys were going in vans, and that's kind of the cool thing about the resurgence of metalcore in the sense that it sort of brought back to me that feeling of what it was like during the early 80s. But, I don't know, it really was a strange thing in the 80s where it just got really out of hand.
The only thing that I think the new wave of British heavy metal and the LA scene had in common was the bands made their own records. Yeah. And that really just told the record company, up your ass, we can do it ourselves.
Well, more so, and I was going to say, I think, the labels here, like Brian Slagle, Metal Blade, and of course Mike Varney, they got influenced by the labels in England, like Neat Records and Heavy Metal and Ebony and all that. I mean, you had the punk independents, which were very independent, but it really was the labels in England that kind of started, and I know that's what inspired, Megaforce, Metal Blade, even Combat and stuff like that were the British labels.
Well, Music for Nations was a big label at first, wasn't it? I mean, it was the first one, rather.
Well, actually, what happened with Music for Nations was, I worked for one of the first independent labels in the UK back in '78. It was called Step Forward Records. In fact, we had Step Forward Records, Illegal Records, a few other names I can't now remember, but it was essentially about 6 people in a room, and we did groups like Alternative TV and Chelsea and The Fall, plus a whole heap of bands you would never have heard of. The idea was very much in those days that, in the early days of punk, that you're not going to get signed by a major record company, so do it yourself. And don't try and sell 1 million copies. Press up 1,000, press up 500. That's good enough, because punk was very against what it saw as a kind of overblown indulgence of big rock stars like Rod Stewart or the Stones. So the kind of reactionary scene. But you did get a pocket of people who all had figured out how to press up 500 or 1,000 copies of a single. And because the UK scene is so small, the music papers would write about it, and suddenly, especially with Sounds and the NME, you'd have a band on the cover. We had Susie and the Banshees on the cover 3 times before they even had a record deal, And by the time you get to the early 80s, you've got a precedent set that you've actually got independent distribution. You've got people that pressing plants will press you up 2,000 copies of a record or whatever it is. And so Iron Maiden, their original demo, if they'd done that in '75, it would have stayed a demo until some producer came in and made a proper album for them. Instead, they pressed up, I think, 5,000 copies and sold them out of their houses, mail order, and at gigs, and of course they sold all 5,000. Music for Nations was started by Martin Hooker, but it was really just Martin and a guy called Jem, and I think one other person, like Martin's girlfriend or something. Just the 3 of them for a very, very long time, and just either signing bands that they thought were cool, but clearly weren't going to get some big record deal, but because there was only 3 of them and they could do things cheap and there wasn't going to be a big advance, if you sold 10,000 copies, everybody would make enough money to live on till they could make the next record. And Johnny Z, the reason he ended up putting Megaforce together was because he couldn't sell that Metallica album to any label. He couldn't get any money for it, so he had to put it out himself to try and make some money back. And of course then, as John says, once the big labels saw these guys actually selling tickets and selling records, they figured, quite understandably, actually, there's money to be made here. Let's do something about it. In the set, Ozzy once told me that Black Sabbath, for instance, they'd put an album out, and 3 months later it would go gold. And that was it. That was job done. There was no expectation that there would be 5 or 6 singles. no videos, no TV to speak of, very little radio play apart from the specialist stations. That was it. That was as far as their expectations went, and then you go off and make another album.
Well, I think Sabbath were kind of the exception. But, again, it did have a lot to do with their touring and all, because they never got radio play in the States back in those days. Maybe Paranoid every, once in a blue moon.
Well, I think that kind of was, obviously Zeppelin sold big numbers, but, Deep Purple had some big albums, but not everything they did. You do talk about groups like Foghat or...
But they were all on the radio, too. They, at least in the States, they all had kind of radio hits.
Did they? I didn't know that.
Yeah, Stairway to Heaven was all over the radio. You can.
Sure, sorry, yeah, of course, Zeppelin,
Foghat was all over the radio. Smoke on the Water was all over the radio.
Well, most people in the States never heard of Stormbringer, for instance.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, there's definitely some obscurity with, a group like Deep Purple, for instance.
In America, it was all about REO Speedwagon and Styx and Foreigner and all that. This is before Motley Crue was signed. So we're talking, it was all the radio formulated rock, Boston, that kind of stuff. So, when I heard about the new wave of British heavy metal, I thought that was just the greatest, most refreshing thing ever. Bands like Saxon, Motorhead, Maiden, all that kind of stuff. And when I saw Armored Saint for the first time, I actually got that vibe of, wow, this is like a British band.
If you remember correctly, we used to, the band used to dress like, like spitting image of Iron Maiden in their first record era.
Absolutely.
The clothes and everything. We could have been the same band if you didn't look twice.
Hey, Joey, I used to see there was a sport that kind of went on in those days where the people that were hep to the new wave of British heavy metal scene would kind of try to figure out which bands we had were who. Like I remember somebody saying that Armored Saint was Iron Maiden and Black and Blue was Def Leppard, and I just thought it was the most hilarious thing I'd ever heard in my life. Like, what is this?
Well,
just pay attention to the band.
I actually owned a pair of black and white striped pants, just the way Steve Harris used to wear. It was
Keep way.
That's how into it we were.
It was funny. That LA scene was so different then. You had the Hollywood scene, and then you had like an Orange County scene, its own little scene. You had Pasadena, had its own little scene, and there were clubs everywhere for bands to play. You could be a Pasadena band and just play throughout Pasadena and be big. Same within Orange County. You had the Woodstock, Radio City, Concert Factory, Joshua's, Jezebel's, Handlebar Saloon, all these, clubs.
Well, you had Adam Wong's and Waters and Fenders and all that stuff.
You could do a little tour. And I know Armored Saint used to do this a lot. You could actually tour and do like the Reseda Country Club, then do a place in Hollywood, then go down to Orange County, Pasadena, and get whole different crowds to come to see
we would do. That's exactly what we would do. That's how we built our following. Was we would make little tours and we would book. We'd take 1 month, maybe 6 weeks, and we would play every weekend that we could in a particular area. So we would go and play this whole area, and it was like a mini tour. And then we'd take a month off or 2 months off, and we'd do it again. And that was how the word got spread.
But I will tell you this, and I've said this before. Armored Saint started headbanging in L.A., and it was that Pookie show that I went to, and it was like nothing I had ever seen before, because you guys had that, the following of the Pasadena crowd. Everyone was headbanging, and I swear to God, that was the first time I ever seen people headbanging. It was like an Iron Maiden show in Los Angeles. This is before Metallica was a band. This was just when Lars and James were getting things together, and I was absolutely floored. And I remember all you guys did a stage dive after, and that was a show really that started. And from there, when you guys played the Troubadour, am I wrong in saying that you were the band that made the Troubadour take their chairs out?
That's true. A lot of the fans that were doing a lot of this headbanging up front were friends of ours that grew up with us or had been friends of ours from the neighborhood. Diego and all those, Danny and all those guys, John Ayala, they were all there. And they were the ones who were causing all the start of this ruckus. So We were the first band to play the Troubadour, where they came in, and the Troubadour used to be like a
supper club.
As John remembers.
It was a supper club. You used to have to buy dinner and drink.
You could see great bands there, but it was like a supper place. There were tables on the floor all the way up to the stage, and it was like that even when the first heavy rock bands started playing there. But the first time we played there, our guys just knocked all the tables to the floor out of the way. And the club freaked out, but from that day on, every time there was a heavy metal show that came in, they just took it as a matter of course. We better move the tables now because, the heavy metal fans are coming in again.
And
you know, Joey's Roxy was the same way for a long time. I mean, they had
Roxy
tables
and the Whiskey. All the Hollywood clubs were like that.
Yeah.
They would.
You want to hear something really funny, you guys? First time I ever saw Brian Slagle, and the first time I ever saw anybody stage dive was at an Oingo Boingo concert. It was the first time I saw anybody jump off a stage, and I remember seeing this guy with red hair walk by, and I remembered him. And I met him like a year or two later.
And was Brian the one doing the stage dive?
No. I just recognized him. He looked like a familiar face. I bet I'd seen him someplace else, but I just remember Oingo Boingo was the first time I ever saw a stage dive.
That'd be great if Brian Slagle did a stage dive at an Oingo Boingo concert.
We can hold that against him forever.
That's a great headline right there.
That's classic. But that was kind of the cool thing about Pasadena and Orange County, because none of those clubs had the chairs. They weren't supper clubs. And to play, to be big in LA, to be like, what Motley Crue and Rat and Steeler and all those bands went to, they had to do the LA scene. And I think Armored Saint were the first band that actually went through that scene, but changed the scene. You brought metal, true European style metal, into that scene. A lot of people think, it must have been Metallica that did this, but when Metallica played the clubs, they didn't have the impact as Armored Saint did. Armored Saint were the first LA metal band to have that impact. And I saw that firsthand, and I've always said that, and I'll say it again.
Well, okay. It's been stated.
There you go.
One of the things that I really admired from that time and having my experience working with record companies was I really thought those bands worked really hard. They practiced hard, they toured hard, they passed out their flyers, they kept in touch with people, they made up their cassettes, they sent them around. They really worked hard. And I really thought the record companies didn't appreciate that they signed these bands. These guys are going to go out there and work for you and sell records because they were hungry to play. They weren't into the chicks. They weren't into that kind of stuff. The drugs came later, all that crap. But I thought these kids really, really wanted to play and really wanted to work hard. And I appreciated that. And when the record companies took their time, I said, you know what, this is gonna work out someday, somehow for all these guys.
Absolutely. Well, the thing about that, you had the competition. You didn't have MTV and all this stuff where all you had to do was make a video and boom, next week you could be a huge video star. You had to work for it. You had to bust your balls. The only thing you had to do were the live shows. And so you had to be good. And there were so many great bands, even before everyone talks about the Motley Crues and all those bands, but there were so many great bands. I'm sure Joey, we had talked about this, and John, I'm sure you've seen them at the Starwood and the Whiskey, bands like Snow and I used to see a la carte.
Snow actually opened for Thin Lizzy once in Pasadena.
Oh yeah, Snow were like poised to be the next Van Halen. I mean, they were a great band. It was for people that don't know, it was Carlos Cavazo and Tony Cavazzo's old band. But I mean, there were people equal to the Eddie Van Halen. I mean, you had Dave Menichetti playing the clubs. You had George Lynch. You had Randy Rhoads, and sometimes you could see them all in one night at the Starwood. I mean, you had to be good because if you weren't good, somebody else would take the position. And it's kind of interesting. Same thing, I guess, in England. I was talking to, I think it was Brian Ross in Blitzkrieg, and he said it was so competitive to get the good gig as a new wave of British heavy metal band in England, especially when the punk scene was so huge. It was so competitive that some of the bands would slash the tires of the trucks of the other bands so they couldn't make it to the gig. So they would go to the gig in their place. And it was, obviously it wasn't that competitive here in LA.
Well, the thing that I kind of, saw, because I'm the one guy that's really, truly from here, always been here, I would see these bands come to town. Like, I remember I worked at a warehouse in the early 80s, and I remember the guys from Rough Cut and Rat walking in. And this is when Jake was in Rat, Jakey Lee. And they would come in, and that some of them had their EPs, and they would try to get the change to carry them, and the record stores to put them in. And they were doing their stuff. But the one thing that I noticed, other than Armored Saint, very few bands really were from here. They all came here.
Sure.
You look at Van Halen brothers, they were here, but you look at Quiet Riot, they're pretty much here. But you look at all these other bands that came. Rat and Rough Cut were from San Diego. Poison later on, they're from Pennsylvania. Warrants from Chicago.
Guns N' Roses from the Midwest.
Fix is from up north. They came here.
It got even worse once MTV got a hold of
everyone was coming to LA.
Like Bang Your Head by Quiet Riot. Like once that was all over MTV, it was like all about we have to go to the music industry, which is in LA. So now you have this flood of people coming in, all during the 80s.
Now, Mick, in England, I know you went to, you had certain clubs, the Marquee, the Rainbow back then. And then you had clubs not just in London, but all over. I mean, a lot of the bands were up in Newcastle, like Raven and, Venom. And
I tell you one thing, Bob, that I was thinking of as the guys were talking about those days and how hard you had to work and what you had to do. Someone would take your spot if you weren't good enough. What was happening here was similar, but the difference was, I think, that in the late 70s, here in the UK, I don't think you can understate the fact that punk and new wave absolutely ruled the club scene. And this was all over the country. I mean, for instance, Iron Maiden had actually been going for at least 3 years before they got to play the Marquee, because they weren't punk. And so they were forced to play with the Marquee in all these places, a bit like how the Roxy and those places are on Sunset Boulevard in West Hollywood. Marquee would be in the West End of London, the 100 Club in the West End, the Music Machine, the Vortex, our own version of the Roxy, all in the West End of London. Iron Maiden never got to the West End of London until they've been going for nearly 4 years. They were playing in pubs and bars in the East End of London. When they finally got a gig up in the north of England, they couldn't believe their luck. I mean, no one had ever taken a chance on them before because they didn't look like all the other punk and new wave bands that were on the cover of the magazines. And Steve Harris, of course, famously said, "It must be easy to be a punk guy. You just get the right haircut and put on the right clothes, and you're a punk guy." It took me 10 years to grow my hair, you know. This ain't no fake. This is real. And Def Leppard up in well, yeah. Well, there you go. I mean, Steve says that, but of course, one of the great things about Maiden in their very earliest days with Paul was that they did kind of have that punky element and had an appeal that did go across the board. But up in the north of England, I mean, that's London, which is like Los Angeles, you know. Up in the north of England, which I guess the equivalent in the US would be the Midwest or the Pacific Northwest, or up in Sheffield where Def Leppard come from, you know, this is a northern city. It's a poor working class environment. There are no glitzy clubs to play. There's the big local concert hall where the big bands will play, and there's maybe one club. I think the one club in Sheffield was the Limit Club, and it was as bleak as it sounds, the Limit Club, you know. So I mean, Def Leppard, their very first show was in a room at the back of a fish and chip shop. You would have to walk through the fish and chip shop to get to this room out the back to see the band play. And a lot of the groups in the new wave of British heavy metal had similar experiences. They weren't allowed to play the regular rock clubs because they were weird. They had long hair, they played this other kind of music. And so when they were given a shot at playing somewhere, some bizarre bar or pub or working man's club that didn't normally have bands, they really gave it their all. They had to put on a show. It really was, punk was very introverted and very kind of about the art of what you were doing. This was more about, can you entertain the people? Can you prove yourself? Are you a great guitarist? Are you an amazing drummer? And I think one of the things that made those early new wave of British heavy metal gigs in this country so interesting for those of us that caught some of them was these kids had come on that you'd never seen of or heard of, maybe heard of but never seen before. I remember Silverwing, you know, they weren't a very good band actually when they finally did make a record, but they were like Kiss, you know, you'd see them in this tiny little bar, and they would come on and there would be little explosions going off and lights and big theatre and the guy throwing shapes, and it was like they were doing Madison Square Garden, you know, but it would be like a bar with 25 people stood in it, you know, and that made it really endeared you to them because these kids tried so hard to grab your attention at a time when rock music just wasn't where it was at in this country. Suddenly it was after that, but at that time, to get the attention, they had to work twice as hard as everybody else.
Yeah. I think it was kind of similar in the States, at least in Orange County where I grew up. You might have remembered the old, it turned into the Concert Factory, but it used to be the Cuckoo's Nest, which was basically the hub of punk rock. And Fullerton and Huntington Beach, too. It was all about the punk. So it was very difficult even in Orange County. And I think in LA it was more the big big new wave scene, as John will remember, and throughout the late
I'll tell you what,
70s.
you guys, New Wave was not that big here. I mean, the biggest venue Roxy Music ever played was about 6,000. It wasn't that big. And I wanted to make a comment. I remember I was working in a record store on Iron Maiden's second tour over, and they were playing Long Beach Arena, and they sold out 3 nights, which is 45,000 tickets and God knows how many T-shirts. And Boy George was headlining the Hollywood Palladium and didn't sell out a 4,000-seat arena.
Right.
Wow.
Iron Maiden's record didn't even make the top 40, and Culture Club was number 1. So there was always that hunger and thirst for metal here. The punk new wave thing here was nowhere near the size it was in England. It just wasn't. When the Sex Pistols did the tour, they didn't come to L.A.
They were selling records, but they wouldn't sell venues. I mean, the records.
They weren't selling that many records either. I mean, it took forever for Nevermind the Bollocks to go gold. I mean, it just really wasn't that big of a scene. Punk bands in L.A. weren't that good. X and the bands that came around here and played here. It just didn't get a foothold like it did over there.
I actually saw at the club, the Woodstock, I saw U2's very first show and walked out on them. They had come over, and I actually went to see an opening band that were a friends of a friend kind of thing. And I wanted to see this band U2 because I had heard this is probably about the time I Will Follow was just starting to kind of break a little bit. And I think their video had just come out, and this was kind of like a teaser tour they did, and they played the Woodstock. And I was so into the new wave of British heavy metal band. I'm going, wow, a band from England. I wanted to stick around for the show. And the funny thing I remember about that show, nobody spoke about Bono, the singer, but there was this huge rumor about the Edge becoming the next Eddie Van Halen.
Oh, God.
Which I thought was kind of funny.
Bob, I saw that tour. I saw that show. They played the Country Club here opening up for somebody else.
Right.
And I went and saw it, and what was really funny, all those new wave bands would come over here, and they got thrown on the road so fast, although U2 wasn't a new wave band, really. They got thrown on the road so fast by their record companies, they didn't have enough songs to play. So if they got an encore, they would play their hit over again. Like U2 played I Will Follow during their set, and then they did it again for the encore. A lot of bands would do that. A lot of those bands, they just didn't have enough songs. Or, Maiden could play for 3 hours the first time they came over here.
Yeah.
You know what I'd like to do, Bob, if everybody's into it? I'd really like to have a little say about all the seminal bands that came from each one of these scenes, and what we thought made them special, and how they broke out of the 100 bands of new wave or British heavy metal and the 50, 60 bands that we saw put out records here. How the bands made it where they got to.
Great. You want to start with that, John?
Well, I would like to start with Mick and Iron Maiden. Did he sense that they were going to be what they were going to be?
Honestly, I didn't know. I was absolutely stunned when their first album hit the charts, first week of release, number 4. At that time, I was working at the PR company, and like I say, we were doing Sabbath, which was like the last days of Ozzy. Dio was about to join, but we were doing Thin Lizzy. In the past, they'd done Ted Nugent, AC/DC. We were doing. I remember doing a tour with Journey and Pat Travers. It was that kind of vibe. Rock music was still that more of a 70s kind of a vibe, I think. And I remember we had a group called Wild Horses, which was Brian Robertson, that had been in Thin Lizzy, the guitarist, and Jimmy Bain. That's right, who'd been a bass player with Rainbow, and
Neil Carter too.
Absolutely right, Neil Carter on guitar and sometimes keyboards, and was it Clive Edwards maybe on drums?
Yeah, on drums, who played some stuff with Uli, I think, afterwards.
That's right, yeah, and I loved them. I thought they were amazing, and they also had been signed to EMI, and I remember thinking, this new wave of British heavy metal stuff, Wild Horses are going to fit right in because they're new and they've just got a deal. And I remember sending that record round to like this guy Neil Kay, who was like the guru of new wave of British heavy metal on the club scene, and including Jeff Barton, journalists, and Malcolm Dome, people writing for the music papers. I thought, well, they love this new wave of British heavy metal. They're going to really dig Wild Horses. And they all hated Wild Horses because Wild Horses were a good band, but they were more in the Thin Lizzy 70s kind of a vibe. And these guys were into Maiden, into Saxon, into Samson, Tigers of Panther. And I didn't get it to begin with. I just thought, but I don't know what the difference is. It's all rock music, isn't it? And it was, no, this is the new rock music. So I did get the Maiden album and have a better listen. And I must admit, in those days, I just thought, this is good, but why is this number 4 in the charts? And Wild Horses on the same label with Famous People is number 28, you know. It wasn't until I saw these bands play live that it really, that's when I knew what the fuss was all about. And I remember seeing Def Leppard opening for Sammy Hagar at the Hammersmith Odeon, and I'd never seen a support band, an opening band, so exciting in my life. I mean, they were kids, of course, and they looked like kids, and they ran around like kids, and it was very, very exciting. And I suddenly realized this new wave of British heavy metal thing, it is rock music, but it is like the next generation of it. And then I saw Saxon, I saw all these bands, and suddenly I realized this was a completely different trip. What John was saying, why did some become famous and not others? You know, I was recently talking to Brian Tatler of Diamond Head, and, you know, I mean, Diamond Head, we all thought were going to be the Led Zeppelin of the scene. We thought they were going to be the ones that really did become very successful. And I think in their case, it was our old friend, you know, bad luck and bad management. I mean, Peter Mensch and Cliff Bernstein were sniffing around looking to manage them and just couldn't get with it. So they turned their attention to Def Leppard. And we all know what happened there. I mean, obviously talent is the first thing, but I do think luck plays a part, and I do think there's no coincidence that Iron Maiden had very experienced management, Def Leppard had very experienced management. I mean, Joey will tell us more about Peter Mensch and people like that. It isn't a guarantee, but boy, I think it does ease the way. And the groups that fell by the wayside, again, I don't think it's any coincidence that these guys didn't have a major label or didn't have major management. And I think they became discouraged. I mean, to me, if there is a difference between the American musicians on the young musicians on the American scene and the British scene, you guys seem to try harder for longer. And I think British musicians get discouraged, or they get successful in Britain and Europe, and they feel like they've made it. And now suddenly they've got to start all over again in America, and they just can't get with it. I remember when this isn't metal, I know, but I remember when the Black Crowes started, there was a group in the UK called the Choir Boys, who Sharon Osbourne picked up for management, and their first album went to number 2 in the UK. They were kind of like Rod Stewart and the Faces. And the Black Crowes and the Choir Boys were both touring America at the same time, endless clubs and bars and anywhere that would have them. And the Choir Boys, all they did every time I met them was moan about it, how tough it was, or what a hard time they were having, big place America was. Oh, we've been away now for 2 months, you know. And then the Crows would be away for a year or something, you know. And again, to me, it was no coincidence that the Crows went on to become really big, and the Choir Boys actually only ever had the one hit and kind of threw in the towel. I mean, they're back now, I'm glad to say, but, you know, I think the young American musicians seem to be made of something that just means they're going to stay the course, come what may. You cannot discourage them. And over here, I think, maybe because it's a smaller scene, a smaller country, you come to the end of the scene real quick here, you know. Maybe it's that too, but I think the ones that really made it were the ones that worked really hard, had great talent, but also were lucky in so much as they got picked up by very experienced people who allowed them to grow and make some good moves.
A good point you bring up. We were actually talking about this with Malcolm Dome and Brian Slagle on the Maiden podcast. We did what made Maiden stand out from the other bands. Of course, management came into play with Rod Smallwood. And, you know, I was talking about the focus of Maiden, of Steve Harris in particular, and his vision, very much so like Lars Ulrich with Metallica. They had a vision to do what they wanted to do. And something you say about American bands working harder, there is something to say about, you know, bands like, you know, the Motley Crues or the Rats and even the Poisons, who I can't stand. they did work. And like, as John had said, they did work. And there were a lot of bands like Great White that got dropped, from EMI, but they kept going and re-signed with Capitol. They didn't have that discouragement. When Maiden came out with their debut record, there were a lot of great debut records that were just as good as Maiden from new wave of British heavy metal bands, if not better, particularly the Diamond Head Lightning to the Nations, the first Angel Witch record, Tigers of Pantang, Wildcats, which I really liked, Samson, Shock Tactics, one of my favorite records, the first Tank album, Hounds of Hades, Holocaust first record. There were a lot of great debut records, but what happened to these bands? They didn't have that focus that Maiden did. They never were able to follow up with a good second or third release, or they broke up, or they tried to cater to the American audience. I think America really fucked up their focus, because they all wanted to be like Def Leppard. As soon as Def Leppard made it to America, then you see Saxon changing their sound, and Biff with his feathered blonde hair, and all these other bands. Again, a lot of it was a pressure from signing with the American label, and I think that was the case with Diamond Head when MCA put them out in America. Tigers at Pantang were on MCA in America. When Raven got that deal with Atlantic, I think they had a lot of pressure, and that's something that Brian Slagle had said too. And Armored Saint as well is a perfect example with Chrysalis. And back then it was almost like you had to do what the record company said, or you don't have a career, you get dropped. And of course, when you're 19, 20 years old, and you're getting this thrust in front of you, you're going to say, well, okay, sure, yeah, we want to be rich and famous, of course. We'll listen to you. And it backfired with so many bands, I think.
Yeah, I think the vision's really, really important. After all these years, too, though. I mean, they're still slugging it out, and they're the OGs of, part of the new...
Is that Saxon you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, absolutely, yeah. They put out some great albums recently.
They didn't give up, and they're still doing it. I mean, I haven't really been following their career that closely, but I mean...
Well, in countries like Germany, they've been playing the big festivals, and I was just watching, any of you listening out there, check out YouTube, Denim and Leather at Vodka, and actually any of the songs. I think they released it as a DVD. But the crowd response is amazing, and their fucking energy live is just unbelievable. But I think it's just that period of time where they lost their focus, and they tried to gear toward America, and that was in the mid to late 80s when metal was at their biggest. And that's why I think Iron Maiden continued on and continued strong, as they never really lost that focus. Hey, it worked for Def Leppard, but for most of the other bands, it just kind of backfired.
I tell you what, talking about Lars and Steve Harris, I think in Joe Elliott you have someone also very similar in so much as a really big collector and connoisseur of rock, just like Lars, not always the same kind of stuff as Lars, but just as avid about the whole thing. He once he got into something, he got into it all the way and took what he did very seriously. And I think Steve and Lars and Joe were great captains of the team who actually did have a very, very strong idea of who they were and what they wanted to become. And I think in Metallica's case, there was great good fortune in so much as they didn't get picked up immediately by a major, and by the time they were working with the big boys, because what the music they were making was so different, I think they were able to force the issue in terms of, no, we don't do it like that, we do it like this. With Iron Maiden, because Rod Smallwood wasn't as established a figure in the business as Peter Mensch, for instance, he took a lot of direction from Steve Harris, and he knew how to work with record companies and knew what a manager was supposed to do, but he took a lot of what, Steve was always telling Rod, we are not doing that, we will only do this, and Rod was really good at enforcing Steve's wishes. I think with Leppard, I really do feel Joe had a very, very strong idea right down the line. And in the early days when I knew them, it would always be Joe and Peter Mensch traveling in the car together. It would always be Joe and Peter Mensch talking. It would always be Joe and Cliff Cliff Bernstein having a little word. I mean, those guys spoke to the whole band, but just like Steve and just like Lars, if you spoke to Joe, you knew, in effect, you were cool. As long as Joe knew what was going on and Joe approved of it, essentially, the job was done. And I think as you mentioned it, Bob, I think those three guys have a great deal in common in terms of being very, very strong personalities that did have this dream that they were lucky enough to help come true,
You know, one of the things I wanted to attach to that thought, Nick, is all three of those bands, their main influence is Thin Lizzy. And Thin Lizzy...
I knew Thin Lizzy was going to come in here sometime.
But, you know, I was just talking to in another conversation today, talking to a TV producer who told me something I didn't know, and that's that the BBC over here are making a Thin Lizzy documentary. I don't know if it's going to be a documentary series or a documentary film, but it's going to be a major deal. They're showing later this year, and they're working closely with Scott Gorham. And the other person they're working with, bizarrely, is Joe Elliott, who is such a huge fan. I think maybe there may even be a show or something, and Joe's going to sing or something like that. And they were also saying, we've got to try and get in touch with Metallica because of the obvious reasons, because they're another band, contemporary band, that were really hugely influenced by Lizzy, yeah, absolutely.
Well, Phil had his vision, and I remember reading the first ever cover story in Rolling Stone about Metallica, and the writer asked Lars, how do you want to be remembered? He says, I want to be remembered, Metallica, like the bands that stuck to their guns and never changed. And he mentioned Thin Lizzy, Van Halen, and AC/DC. The seminal bands that it didn't matter what was going on, they were going to go out and do their thing, and they knew they were going to go down great.
Good point.
Phil's another strong personality too, kind of going in with the three-party of Joe and Steve and Lars, of course, and Phil would be also cast in that same role, being the director, so to speak, of the band, and he was main songwriter and all that. So you need to have that element in a group.
I think
what yeah. Sorry, go on.
I was going to say, I think what cursed Thin Lizzy was just bad luck, and that was something John and I had talked about on previous podcasts. Every time we came to, major tours coming up, something happened with the band, where other bands succeeded because of good luck. It's just some of those unfortunate things. Back then touring was so important, and it's funny, John mentions Foghat. You could mention certain bands like how Status Quo was so influential in England and all over Europe, but you talk to any rock fan in America, they probably never even heard of Status Quo, literally.
But if they ever saw them, they sure they'll remember them.
Foghat were huge here, but why? Because Foghat toured here. Status Quo never really did proper tours here. Same with Queen and Sweet. Queen toured here at the time. Sweet never really made it over, whereas I think Queen took a lot from Sweet, but Queen made it huge in America, whereas Sweet were, huge everywhere else.
The problem I have with it, Sweet Bob, Sweet didn't have a star in them. Queen had a star in them.
True. Of course, radio hits helped. And Sweet had plenty of radio hits at the time.
Back in those days, about 90% of the time, the first time you ever heard about a band was either a friend or you saw it in a paper. And then now, the first time you hear about a band might be on TV.
It's true. I tell you what else as well for the British bands in the 70s was, come the 80s, that thing we were saying about in the 80s, how they had the cookie cutter mentality and each album was expected to sell millions and there'd be lots of hit singles. Joe, you made me laugh early on when you said your first album for 10 years and all this kind of stuff. Back in the 70s when people were putting out, even Elton John was putting out 2 albums a year,
He put 9 out in his first 3 years, you guys.
Crazy.
Elton John put out 9 albums in his first 3 years.
Wow.
That's more than Guns N' Roses have managed in 25 years. But the idea was, and in fact Scott Gorham said this recently, was, it would have helped if Lizzy could have taken a year off. Maybe things would have turned out different for them if they could have just taken a year off. But in those days, the idea of not being around Lizzy put out Jailbreak and Johnny the Fox in the same year,
Yeah.
You couldn't disappear from the public eye, because if you did, your career might be over. And a lot of those groups were really convinced that if they went to America, the only way to make it would be to go there and pretty much live there for a couple of years and concentrate on America and tour America. And they were frightened that if it didn't pay off, by the time they came home, they would have lost what they had here as well. That happened to a lot of groups especially the groups like Sweet and Slade, who relied on hit singles. They had it good over here. They lived in nice houses and they were on TV. Suddenly they're in Detroit or somewhere, and no one knows who they are, and they're opening for somebody, or it's a little club, and a lot of them I know regret that they didn't do it now, but I think I can, in those days where you really felt your career might only last 2 or 3 years, you can see why they may have been nervous about it.
The English musicians have always been afraid about how big America is, haven't they?
Yeah.
All right. Well, yeah, but you got to remember that we grew up. America wasn't like going to Germany or Canada or Australia. Going to America was like going through the looking glass. You know, it was first time I went to America. I was ringing people at home and holding the phone to the TV while I changed channels to show them how exciting American TV was, because they had more than 3 TV channels, right. and it was on at 1 a.m. You can't imagine what it's like to have been a British person in the 60s and 70s and think about going to America. You may as well have been doing a moonshot. You know, it was just considered that amazing other planet, you know. It was the dream, but it was also, you know, terrifying.
Do you think it's still like that now?
I think a lot of it is. It's different now. I mean, I've got 3 children now. I got my eldest daughter is 9, and I got another daughter who is 7. And because they watch Hannah Montana and High School Musical and Wizards of Waverly Place, and they listen to Lady Gaga and Pink, and they talk with American accents when they're play acting. They don't have American accents, but when they're, you know, kids play and they play, I can't do the accent because it would be too embarrassing for me to do the accent to 3 American guys, but these girls, my girls, talk to each other in American accents like Hannah Montana when they're playing out games and acting out roles. You know, we're across the ocean, but we're like Hawaii, you know, we're just another part of America, to be honest with you, these days.
On behalf of America, I deeply apologize for that.
Well, listen, don't, because I loved living over there, and I didn't plan to come back. It was an accident. I didn't come back to stay. I just, it was accidental that I stayed, and it is a fantastic place, and nowhere is perfect in the world. But you know what we were saying earlier about how you guys love the British bands, and the British bands love the American bands? I mean, this goes all the way back to Elvis, you know. I mean, Elvis and Buddy Holly influenced...
You guys liked our blues guys better than we did.
Yeah. Probably true, yeah. I mean, by the time the Beatles arrive in America with the so-called British invasion, you've got a bunch of guys that have been listening to Buddy Holly and the Everly Brothers and Little Richard, and, you know, America invented rock and roll, and the British did a pretty good job at their own version of it, and still do. But let's be fair, there have been some great European bands, and there have been some great Japanese bands, and South American bands, and Canadian bands, Australian bands. There are great bands from all over the world. But the best bands, gentlemen, are American and British, most of them.
Sure.
I remember the first time I got to hang with Ross Halfon, I said, you got to tell me, dude, who are your favorite bands? And he goes, Aerosmith, Kiss, and ZZ Top. I go, what? You don't like Rolling Stones, Thin Lizzy, and Free?
Well, you know, it is funny because all like me as well. I grew up on, you know, Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, Zeppelin, Rainbow, all the British bands. I mean, I like Ted Nugent and Aerosmith and, you know, Montrose and those bands, but not as much as the British bands were, you know, the greatest bands around from the 70s up through the 80s to the new wave of British heavy metal. And it seemed after the new wave of British heavy metal, once the late 80s came around, the British scene completely died when it came to metal. Why do you think that happened, Mick?
In what era did you say, Bob?
You know, after the new wave of British heavy metal, there wasn't really a new metal movement, and there still really hasn't been a big one in England throughout the 90s.
Well, we do get bands, but you're right. I mean, it hasn't thrived in the same way. Occasionally we get some great bands come along, but not in the same way of Iron Maiden or going back to Thin Lizzy or even Judas Priest and people like that. I mean, in the late 80s we had a band, Thunder, who looked like they
I love them.
A great band, got signed to Geffen in America. I think they were, again, a little unlucky with their timing. Maybe they would have fitted in a little better in the grunge era, I don't know, but they weren't that kind of hair metal thing. They weren't thrash. They weren't grunge. They were kind of more of the 70s vibe. They just had good songs and good players and singer. They were a good band. We've had recent bands like The Answer that people talk about being very good. I tell you, actually, one group I would put in a special category now in this country, and I guess you're aware of them. They're called Porcupine Tree. Do you know them?
Yeah, progressive band. I know, Joey, you like them, right?
Yeah, Porcupine's great.
Yeah, I mean, for me, they're doing interesting stuff. I think a lot of the other bands I mentioned are not doing anything you haven't heard before, you know. Whereas I think Porcupine Tree are trying very hard to be new and exciting and be part of the rock spectrum. So I guess what I'm saying is that I think there's still hope for the British scene, but you're right. It has. I mean, those were big days, and they haven't been replicated. I mean, most of our exciting scenes now get diluted into what was Britpop in the mid-90s with Oasis and groups like that, or the Prodigy, the whole kind of dance rock thing. I think Radiohead are very interesting. Well, you know, yeah, I'm at a loss for words now. Yeah, that really did cut me off. No, that's it now.
Well, you know, you brought up the Hannah Montana. I got to, you know, throw something
Get me
back
back,
to England,
yeah.
you know?
Well, maybe it's a good thing that maybe it should be left alone. That surgence of new wave of British heavy metal happened at a particular time, and it happened at a particular time for a reason. You know, maybe we should be thankful that it was only going to be at that time. You know, how could it ever come back and be the same as it was?
With any
Same
genre,
goes
not
for-
just the new wave of British heavy metal, but I think.
Yeah, I mean, every even including what happened here in the States. I mean, things will never be the same as they were in the early '80s. But I don't know, maybe it's a good thing, you know.
Well, John, what do you think were some of the seminal bands of the '80s, whether it be the LA scene or bands you were involved with?
We went through the new wave of British heavy metal. I have the same, reservation. I really thought Diamond Head was the cream of the crop, and it didn't work out. But, here, I mean, I thought, to me, Metallica, first of all, they took off. They went to San Francisco, and they made it up there. So they really didn't stick around here to do all that stuff. But to me, the two bands that I liked the most were Armored Saint and Sound Barrier. And I wasn't that big of a fan of Rat. I didn't like Stephen Pearcy's vocals. Dawkins was good, but I didn't really know where they were going in the beginning. I think they needed a producer. And then, I just lived off the energy. And to me, the most energetic bands were Armored Saint and Sound Barrier. Sound Barrier had incredible musicianship, and Saint just worked so hard and sweat and played and just ripped up. I just couldn't see how those bands could be denied. I was shocked that Rat became huge.
Can I just agree with John there? I'm not saying it's just because we've got Joey here. I mean,
Yes, you are. All of you.
no, seriously, because at Kerrang it was like Armored Saint. This will sound weird because we didn't mean it musically, but in terms of excitement and being new and young and they're going to rule the roost, we thought like Armored Saint would do like what Def Leppard did. We just thought they were just going to be just completely rule the world, and it's still odd to me that didn't happen. It's a bit like, say, with King's X a bit later on in the decade, where here comes this amazing band that you just think, well, it's a no-brainer, that this is a great band, they're just going to have a great career, and that's the end of that. But it actually didn't pan out that way in terms of big numbers, Doesn't mean the records aren't still great, but it didn't work out the way we just assumed it would,
I remember after we made our first record, March of the Saint, and we were up at Chrysalis in the big high-rise building doing press or something, and I think it was Howard Johnson who came over and interviewed us for Kerrang, and so, whatever, made his comments on the record or whatever, gave the record review, and in closing, he said he gave me kudos for wearing an old original Metal Blade T-shirt in a Chrysalis Records office. and then one of the best compliments I ever got, and I felt sort of vindicated by being such a fan of, as I said earlier, of the whole British movement. He was comparing us to all the other bands in the U.S. that were coming out at the time, and he said that we had more in common with the Mud at Donington than we did anything else. And so to me, that was like, I felt like I was a warrior that got the war paint on my face at that point. And it was a great moment. But it all goes back to, one problem was that we didn't have a Steve Harris in the band, or a Lars, or a Joe Elliott. We were just five guys sort of like running around in circles, and we felt like we didn't know enough about the business at that point. Well, that's why we have a manager. They should make these decisions, and this is why we have a label, so they should make these decisions. But in hindsight, it would have been much better if we had someone that was looking out for us and within ourselves. But again, you got to throw in bad timing. You got to throw in the luck element, as Mick pointed out, which is probably one of the most important elements. All those things combined, they're going to set you up for a lot of holes in the floor that you can fall through. There's a lot of other reasons too. I mean, it just wasn't meant to be, but that's just how it goes sometimes.
Well, for my 50 cents, you guys should have went straight to Europe and just screwed America.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think Armored Saint fit in with what was going on at L.A. at that time. I mean, Metallica got out of L.A., went to San Francisco. I think if Metallica stayed in L.A. and signed with a major label, they could have suffered the exact same consequences.
Yeah.
I agree.
It's true. And when I remember getting signed the first time we signed with Chrysalis, there was all this sort of like secondhand talk you would hear, these guys are our Def Leppard, these guys are our Def Leppard, and it was like, well, we're not. We're, we like I swear, even at that time, our goal was still to go and play the marquee. This was like 1984. But we're still, like, we hadn't given up on that. Like, we had to go to Europe.
All the labels wanted to push their bands, like the Def Leppard, to the MTV sound. And you got to remember, Chrysalis was a big radio label. I mean, they had Billy Idol at the time that was hot. Huey Lewis and the News had, I think, one of the biggest albums, Sports, around that time.
It was by far the wrong place for us.
Well, Bob, Chrysalis was a boutique label. They I don't think they had 20 employees. It wasn't a big record company.
But they geared toward the radio, and I think that was their biggest mistake with Armored Saint. And, having Michael James Jackson, that album was so geared toward radio, but those were not radio songs. Hearing those songs live were, I think, just as potent as hearing Metallica live.
He was brought to us because, again, he was coming off of Creatures of the Night. And I'll never forget, we were in pre-production sitting there with Michael James Jackson, and we were just having a conversation about, getting to know each other and sharing bands that we like and stuff. And so we talked about Black Sabbath. We were huge Martin Birch fans, and we were, like, talking about Sabbath and their production and stuff. And his response was, I never really liked Black Sabbath. and so there's five guys standing there with our jaws on the floor, like, what the fuck did you just say?
That was your clue.
That was too late though. That was our nail in our coffin. We were like, we are so fucked. We should have fired him right there, but there's no way we could do that. And that was the nail in the coffin. We're like, it's over, it's done. Of my band.
But I do agree with you guys. I think Armored Saint, and John brought up an incredibly underrated band in Sound Barrier. I mean, Bernie Kay, one of the greatest singers, Spacey T, what a great guitar player. And let's not forget about Total Eclipse, too, the band that followed.
They're good band.
Another great band that, again, were cursed with bad luck. I think they were too early to be the first all-black rock metal band. And Living Colour took the glory out of that, but it really should have been Sound Barrier. They were the first and the original, and they pounded it out, man. I used to see them in the clubs open for Rat and all those bands, and they just blew them off the stage. Great band.
Yeah, they were the first of all the bands to get signed too. They were the first one to get signed.
Yeah, they got signed to RCA, right, or MCA?
MCA, yeah.
MCA, the Music Cemetery of America.
Yeah, they actually played with Armored Saint. They played with us at the Roxy one time, and I was blown away by the musicianship in the band. Because, like nowadays you kind of take musicianship a little bit for granted, because we've seen everybody from Joe Satriani and Steve Vai and who they influenced. So now everybody you see nowadays is like fucking just blows me away. But back in the mid-'80s, late 80s, you didn't so much see it as much then. And back then, seeing them play live was like, oh my God, where are these guys from?
Well, too, Joey, if you went to the clubs in L.A. from about 78 to 84, you could see Eddie Van Halen, Randy Rhoads, George Lynch, Yngwie, Warren DeMartini, Dave Pritchard, Tommy Thayer, Jakey Lee, Spacey T. Dave Mustaine. Who had better guitar players than that?
Absolutely.
In their talent?
That's true.
I mean, it was unbelievable the amount of talent that was in this town at that time.
Absolutely. People take that for granted, but there was an amazing amount of talent in that place.
Yeah, it was.
And even if the songs were kind of cheesy in the glam era, I mean, the guitar players just were absolutely stunning. And the bands I thought had the most potential out of L.A. never made it, and that was Armored Saint, Warrior. I thought that album Fighting for the Earth was amazing. I thought that was going to be a monster record. And Malice. I thought Malice were a great band as well. Live, they were amazing. I thought their first album had some great songs. Very Judas Priest, obviously. But I think being in LA at that time, that if you weren't a glam band or a thrash band, you kind of didn't belong. And thrash kind of happened after. I think, Metallica obviously opened those doors after they went to San Francisco. And it wasn't until Slayer hit L.A. where thrash was...
Slayer came later, and they...
Bob, to me, thrash was almost more of an Orange County thing. It wasn't that big of a deal.
Well, you know why it was? Because all these bands were on the outskirts of Orange County. I mean, you could say, Metallica was kind of Orange County because Lars was from Newport, and of course, James and Ron McGovney were living on Norwalk, which is on the outskirts, and Dave Mustaine was from Huntington. Slayer were in that same area, the Downey area. But all these bands played Orange County because you couldn't play Hollywood. Armored Saint was, again, the only band of that genre that really stuck out and conquered the Hollywood, the troubadour.
And maybe it was because of our proximity, because we're mostly from the Pasadena area.
I don't think that. I think it was just the fact that it was a lot easier to build a following in Orange County. Orange County had great clubs there, Concert Factory, Woodstock, Radio City. They really catered to the heavier bands.
What did you guys think about Motley Crue? Didn't you guys think they were going to make it?
When I first saw them, or one of their first shows was at Radio City in Orange County, and Rat had opened and Sound Barrier. Or no, I'm sorry. That was a different show. Sound Barrier played with them. But Rat had opened. I think Jakey Lee was playing in the band then. I didn't really care for them. I thought they were good for what they did. But again, I was more into the European style stuff. But I thought they would probably make it big.
I knew they had songs, Bob. I knew they had songs. But you guys remember the big furor when Motley Crue got the opening slot for Kiss at the Universal Amphitheater, and they came out wearing makeup? Everybody went crazy. They went insane.
I saw them at Irvine Meadows, that tour. That was a Creatures of the Night tour, right? When Kiss had that big tank.
Yeah, they had that tank on stage for the drum set. And then when they did that, it seems like, you went to the other side? It's like our heavy metal version of Bob Dylan playing electric guitar. You know what I mean?
Well, I think with Motley Crue it was a timing thing, and they happened to fit in right with the whole MTV thing, and they kind of led the way.
I'm glad I was there, and I saw all this stuff.
I saw Motley Crue's very first show at the Starwood ever.
Oh, boy.
What was it like?
They were pretty terrible.
Well, there's no musician in that band. I mean, Tommy.
The best musician was Tommy. I mean, Tommy was always a good drummer. I used to follow him, and he played in a band.
You played in a band together right before he joined Motley Crue, right?
Yeah, I was in a band with him for about a year before the incarnation of Motley Crue. But he was always a great drummer. He very influenced by Tommy Aldridge, and you could tell just by watching him play. But great drummer. He was a guy who carried that group from the very get-go, musician-wise. Of course, Nicky was the one who wrote, he did write good songs. We all have to admit that he was the guy who had the vision of being that guy and writing the great music that he did. But, they weren't exactly a musician's band. They were more about touching on...
They were a girls' band. They wrote songs about sex. I mean,
talk about lucky, though. Vince Neil was a horrible singer. He used to sing in a band called Rock Candy. I think they were from Orange County. They played there a lot, and he was just fucking horrible. I think the image was just what got him the gig. They wanted a guy with blonde hair to contrast with their dark hair. And
you could even tell by the first gig, though, even though musically it was pretty bad, but you could really tell that something was going on there that was a good
They had an image. They wore those spike-heeled shoes, and they wore their leather even if it was 95 degrees outside.
It was
guys with hair blacker, and Vince would dye his hair whiter.
Yeah. When you talk about promoting, John, about some of these bands, and I think a lot of the bands learned from Motley Crue, the bands that came over from the Midwest or the East Coast, like Poison and all that, you would see flyers everywhere. They put those ads in BAM. They were together.
And they had a logo. They had a logo with their pentangle and all that stuff. They were already marketing themselves.
Well, there you have it. That does conclude Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast number 34, and what a great discussion. That discussion, of course, was with the great Mick Wall, John Sutherland, and Joey Vera.